I think that for every atheist philosopher, at one point they'll have to face the mammoth of Alvin Plantinga.
Yeah, the fine-tuning argument, just in a nutshell, is this idea that there's certain kind of physical constants to the laws of nature or the initial conditions of the universe right at the Big Bang that seem highly finely tuned. It seems like we've been programmed to believe in God.
You consider Chesterton and C.S. Lewis to be philosophers? All right, Dr. Isaac Choi, welcome.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, so it's been a while since we've talked in person, and now that school is out of session, how are you?
Good. I feel a lot less exhausted from all the busyness of the semester, and especially last semester, like the busiest semester I've ever had. And so I'm glad that like it's a little bit of a break. I mean, there's still a lot of work to do, but I'm a lot more flexible and like working from home. As you can see, this is my messy home office. But yeah, so just trying to recover from the semester and get back into the swing of things.
So Dr. Choi is a professor at Georgefox University. He completed his postdoc at Oxford, his bachelor's at Harvard, and he's gone on to do a lot of studies into the sciences as well as philosophy as a whole. So it's really great to have you here. And as someone who has delved extensively into science as well as philosophy, it kind of leads me to the first topic, and the point that we have is whether philosophy is even a useful mechanism to get to truth. And to quote Stephen Hawking, philosophy is dead and has not kept up with modern physics. Um, what do you kind of take of that quote, and whether we can even still use philosophy to get to truths? And do you agree with Stephen Hawking?
Well, I definitely don't agree with Hawking. That quote is from his book, The Grand Design, which he co-wrote. And what's interesting there in that quote is he talks about how philosophy is outdated and we have to throw philosophy away and we just focus on science. And then he spends the next chunk of his book doing philosophy, right? It's kind of like, in terms of like the philosophy of science, how do we know truth, all these kind of things, those kinds of questions are not empirical questions. They're not questions that you can, do an experiment in a lab and find out the truth about those things. Those are things that you have to debate as, doing philosophy. And the problem with people who kind of poo-poo philosophy and say, oh, this is worthless junk, like the problem is that they eventually end up doing philosophy anyway, and this kind of, unconsciously start doing philosophy and then come up with really bad or illogical positions or arguments for their views. And so, in effect, people become bad philosophers by trying to throw out philosophy. So, philosophy, I mean, it's a really difficult thing to even define. But my PhD advisor, Alvin Plantinga, he very famously says philosophy is just thinking really hard and systematically about a certain subject, right? And so I kind of like that definition. Um, I think you can go a little bit further and say things like, you know, um, trying to really think through different arguments and evidence and counter arguments for positions and views about like the biggest questions, right? Things like, what is reality? How can we know? Is there right or wrong? Does God exist? These kind of like the biggest kinds of questions that anyone can ask. And most of those questions we actually can't address through science, right? You can't address them through your five senses. And that's kind of where, Hawking wants to go, right? He falls within this kind of empiricist tradition in philosophy, ironically. He falls within this philosophical tradition that says the only things that we can know about are the things that we can do through our five senses or through science. But the thing is, there's so many things in the world that we can't know through science. There's so many truths that everyone agrees about, and yet we can't really approach whether or not they're true or false from a purely scientific or from a purely sensory kind of way. And so I think that this is where philosophy is important because like, well, we can get to those things more indirectly in terms of arguments for and against these things as opposed to just through our senses. So I think just in a nutshell, I think that I would definitely disagree with Hawking on that.
Yeah, I think. Do you think he's drawing a parallel to? I know in the 20th century there was a movement called logical positivism, which was it was pretty
Yeah.
huge within academic circles. And to briefly explain it, it was kind of this idea that if you cannot verify something scientifically, I think that was it, or if it's not,
Empirically, like
yeah,
through
yeah,
your
empirically, or if
senses.
it's not like
Yeah.
mathematically provable, it shouldn't really be treated with much respect in academic circles. And kind of the problem with this was that it kind of failed its own test. The verification principle is hard to verify. Do you think he's drawing parallels to that, or do you think the quote that he specifically said is kind of branching off of the idea of logical positivism?
Yeah, I think definitely so. I mean, I don't know if he would identify himself as a logical positivist, but it's definitely
Mm-hmm.
within the spirit of it, right? In the sense that like they would even go so far, the logical positivists in the mid 20th century
Yeah.
would say things like, you can't even a statement can't even be meaningful at all. It doesn't even mean anything if you can't verify it, right? And so that's just a extremely strong thing. It's not even just disrespectable in academic circles. It's just not even meaningful in any way. It's literally nonsense, right? It doesn't have any sense or meaning to it. And I think he's probably along that is in that spirit that he's trying to have this view. But as you just said, like what happened with logical positivism is that within a few decades, people just realized that it's self-destructed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so like there are no logic. Well, actually, that's not quite true. I
Oh.
think someone actually there's someone found one living philosopher who says that he's a logical positivist. But everyone else thinks it's just a dead project. It's like it kills itself. It's intellectual suicide. Because as you said, there's no way that you could verify logical positivism
Mm-hmm.
with your senses or with science. And so therefore, by its own lights, it's nonsense. It's literally meaningless. And of course, they wouldn't believe that, so therefore it can't be true, right? And so I think a similar kind of thing happens with folks like Hawking, who really wants to kind of put this strong fence around what is empirically observable, around what is scientifically provable, and it just basically self-destructs in many ways. Now, I think he to some degree, Hawking is right in the sense that many philosophers um, don't keep up with the science. Many of them don't have scientific background. So like, I studied physics and chemistry in my undergraduate years, so I have a pretty good grip on the science. But a lot of my colleagues in graduate school, they were philosophy undergraduate majors, and so they weren't aware of like quantum physics or general relativity or any of these things. And so for them, I can understand why Hawking would be like, oh, these guys don't have any idea. They're stuck in the 1800s or something like that in terms of scientific theories. But that's not true of all philosophers. There are a good number of philosophers who do keep up with science, who have a very healthy respect for science. And so I think he's painting with too broad of a brush in terms of philosophy being outdated or being ignorant of contemporary science.
I guess, yeah. Do you know what the general consensus is on what scientists actually think of philosophers? Do they think
Well,
highly
it's
of them?
interesting.
Yeah.
I think it really depends on, the individual field and the individual philosopher, right? So Albert Einstein, for example, like he was, very much the opposite of um, Hawking, and he studied philosophy quite a bit, actually.
Mm-hmm.
He actually wrote, and he actually even changed his mind about the philosophy of science during his career. And so I think that, and he's obviously one of the most influential scientists of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it depends on the scientist, right? And
Yeah.
that depending on their own temperament, depending on how they've been educated in it, the kind of conversation partners they've had, these kinds of things. Um, so, and I think especially one field where there's a lot of interaction between like physicists and philosophers is in kind of the more theoretical areas of physics. So I know a good number of philosophers of physics, specifically some of whom who have PhDs in physics as well as PhDs in philosophy. And they often work together with physicists who are working at like the bleeding edge areas of physics, in having conferences together, in collaborating together, things like that, because at a certain level, they start kind of melding into each other, right? I mean, something that a lot of people don't realize is that science is a very recent kind of term, right? So it's only within the last several hundred years where there actually is this distinct discipline called science. Before then, science was called natural philosophy. It
Oh.
was one section, it was a
Mm-hmm.
subsection of philosophy. So, like Isaac Newton, right? Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
one of the most famous physicists of all time, he thought of himself as a natural philosopher, right?
Yeah.
And so, he didn't call himself a scientist, he called himself a natural philosopher. And that's the title of his great Principia, the book that
Principia
he
Mathematica.
lays out,
Isaac
right? And
Newton.
so I think
Yeah.
that, yeah, so I mean, I think that there are deep connections. In many ways, philosophy has birthed science, right? It's that when science has enough empirical tools to kind of go off on its own, it's like, okay, we go, you go with philosophy's blessing, but I think especially in some of the more theoretical areas, there's still a good amount of collaboration and overlap between science and philosophy.
Yeah, I was gonna say because I thought it was very interesting you brought up Albert Einstein. I don't know if this is completely true, but I think I did hear someone say that Albert Einstein famously said something about scientists being poor philosophers at one point. So I do kind of wonder what Einstein would take of Hawking's quote. I do remember Hawking said something earlier, and there was a book that was written about it. He said something about gravity creating the universe from nothing, and I
Yeah.
was like, oh, that's quite an interesting take because I guess when it comes to laws, I wasn't sure whether laws create stuff, whether F equals ma.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
I think his quote is something like, I mean, this is not an exact quote, but it's closer to what he said. I think he said something like, because there is a law of gravity,
Mhm.
then the universe can come into existence from nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So
I
he grounds this idea of the universe coming out of existence from nothing in the law of gravity.
mhm.
Right. I think that's problematic though, because like the way he says it sounds like he's saying that the law of gravity is this thing that's out there
Mhm.
and it kind of births the universe, or it kind of generates the universe or something like that.
Mhm.
But I think that's not how most kind of philosophers of physics and philosophers of science in general think about the laws of nature. Like the laws of nature are not this thing just in that's distinct and separate from the universe.
Yeah.
It's the laws are just kind of descriptions of how the universe operates, right? And so like, they're really kind of ideas in our minds in terms of
Mhm.
how the universe works. So it's hard to think that if before the universe existed, there would be this law of gravity out there. No, that's just a thought or a concept that we have in our minds. It's not this, doesn't have this independent reality from the universe. Just like if we say, oh, the laws of heredity, right? In
Yeah.
terms of genetic, genetic variation and heredity, things like that. It's not like there's something out there called the laws of
Yeah.
heredity. And it's causing, the chromosomes to, mix in these particular ways. No, no, no. The laws of heredity are the ways in which we describe how heredity works,
Mhm.
and the different mechanisms involved. But it's not somehow like causing these things to happen. So I think he has a very confused view of what the laws of nature are.
Yeah. It is interesting. Okay, I was gonna briefly touch on that like there was a famous idea that was a counterexample. It was about like billiard balls, like kind of pool balls moving across a table, and it's where like F equals ma does not necessarily generate force, mass, or acceleration.
Mhm.
Um, and I think with Einsteinian physics, I don't know if I'm being correct scientifically. So if I'm completely wrong, then I'll just cut this out. But
Okay.
from what I know, it wasn't it like gravity is literally kind of the benditure of like space-time fabric. I think is the way that Einstein put it.
Yeah, the curvature of space and time. Yeah, that's Einstein's view.
Oh, okay. How is it accepted nowadays? Actually, I'm not completely sure about that.
So I mean, so that is what you just said in terms of like gravity being like the result of the curvature of space and time. That is the standard view in what's called the general theory of relativity or the theory of general relativity. It's kind of the larger, more sophisticated theory that Einstein came up with after he came up with the theory of special relativity, right? So general relativity is like the broader idea, and so. This is very widely held to be at least somewhere near the truth. But I think most like informed thinkers and physicists would say there's something wrong with our most cutting edge physics, both in terms of general relativity and quantum mechanics, because these are two of our most well confirmed, well documented theories, and yet they are strictly speaking incompatible with each other, right? They can't both be true. And so as a result, um, one of the issues here is that when you talk about the quantum mechanics of the very like gravitationally dense, like think about like the at the center of a black hole or at the Big Bang singularity, right? Like super high density.
Yeah.
Once you try to put in quantum mechanics in there, what you get is a whole bunch of infinities in terms of the equations.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's physically meaningless. You need to
I see.
there must be something wrong there. And so we know that there's something wrong. And so that's why we're trying to come up with what's called theories of quantum gravity, in which you're trying to reconcile gravity with quantum mechanics. And so depending on the individual theory of quantum gravity, it may or may not be similar to what Einstein said in his theory of general relativity.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's a little complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you kind of bracket out the quantum world, if you bracket out the Big Bang or bracket out black holes, then general relativity is at least somewhat close to what reality is. So
Mhm.
anyway, that's a
Yeah,
that's a kind of an aside, but yeah.
I did want to briefly say I think the kind of discovery of quantum physics did have a bit of an effect on the whole free will debate at one point, and people were wondering like whether we can get free will from like a determined universe or an undetermined universe. Um, I think earlier people were, I don't know if this is completely true. I think a lot of people were set on this idea that the universe is kind of determined.
Mhm.
I'm not completely sure what the new, like the update of quantum physics introduced to the idea, but I
Yeah.
do know it is pretty huge, what it
Yeah.
can
I
do.
have a whole lecture on that actually.
Oh,
Does quantum mechanics rescue free will? That's the title of the talk.
oh,
Um,
interesting. Hmm.
But very briefly, before the 20th century, and basically between Newton and Einstein, or between Newton and quantum mechanics, um, the widespread scientific consensus was determinism, right? That the universe, there was only one possible future, the laws of physics determined that future, and so we had no free will, right? Quantum mechanics comes along, and a lot of people interpret it to mean that there's a certain kind of fundamental randomness at the lowest levels of reality. And so therefore, it kind of opens up the room for free will. I think that's kind of a mistaken view, actually. I think
Oh,
that
okay.
the reality is that there are actually maybe a couple dozen different interpretations of quantum mechanics. We're not actually sure what's going on at the physical level. We have these equations that work really well that predict like the behavior of electrons like a super precise way. Um, and the predictions have been borne out through experiments and things like that. So we have the equations, but we don't know what's actually underneath the equations, like what's actually going on at the physical level. And so there are multiple interpretations, and some of these interpretations are deterministic, and some of them are indeterministic. In other words, some of them, you know, have room for randomness, and some of them there's no randomness at all. It's just as deterministic as Newton, right? And the notorious thing about quantum mechanics is that all these interpretations are equally well confirmed by experiment, right?
Hmm.
They don't make any difference in terms of predictions of the experiment. And so therefore, there's no way we can tell which of these interpretations is correct, at least so far,
Yeah.
right? And so the question of whether or not there's room for free will in the universe, at least from quantum mechanics, is still kind of up in the air,
Hmm.
right? Um, yeah,
I think the remaining thing is like people are saying, well, just because it's undetermined doesn't necessarily mean you have free will. It can just be determined by things that are random. That doesn't
that's right.
necessarily produce control. I think I'm sorry. This was like that was like a whole tangent that we went on. Um,
That's okay.
I wanted to kind of I think I'll kind of dial it back and trace it back into the overall theme of what we're supposed to talk about at least. I wanted to ask, what do you think about the importance of learning philosophy for theism in particular? And one of the very famous secularist philosopher Quentin Smith remarked that God was not dead in academia, and he returned to academia in the 1960s, and his last stronghold is within philosophy departments, which I think is just that's a really awesome quote. What do you take about it and the importance of learning philosophy for theism?
Yeah, I think that, in the mid 20th century, theism and Christianity in in the discipline of philosophy was pretty much dead, right? The only people who were believers in God were people who were teaching at Christian schools and Christian universities. But in terms of the mainstream secular academia, like everyone was just like, well, God is dead. There are no good reasons to believe in God. Logical positivism was so powerful, and they said, well, you can't put God in a test tube, and so therefore it's even meaningless to even speak about God, right? It became so, this logical positivist view became so influential that even theologians started saying, well, is there some way we can verify God? Or maybe like,
Oh, interesting.
maybe at the second coming, like if we see Christ coming down in the judgment seat of God and we can see him with our eyes, then that could be verification for God or so on and so forth. I'm just like, that's just ridiculous, right? And so I think what happened was though that as logical positivism self-destructed and people realized, oh, this is actually not a good view to have, then that kind of reopened the possibility that actually we can have knowledge or at least have arguments for and against views beyond just our senses. And so I think one of those things, many of these things were, questions in ethics and metaphysics, things that you can't directly observe. And philosophers started working on these different problems and talking about the possibility of having moral knowledge and having knowledge of God and things like that. And so basically in the 60s and 70s, I think it started having this huge sea change. And so much so that nowadays, I think, last time I looked, I think something like 20 to 25% of professional philosophers in the US say they believe in God, right? And still less than the majority,
Yeah, yeah.
that's true. But compared to many other academic disciplines where like, the people who say they believe in God is like much smaller percentage, that's a substantial number. And in one of the most kind of um, rigorous disciplines in the humanities, I think that is saying a lot that people can, you know, publicly say that they believe in God, even publish about their views on God. I think that's very significant. And I think in terms of the overall kind of theistic um, kind of worldview, I think philosophy is so important. And I'd say for, many different reasons, but I'll just talk about two. And the first is that many of the objections to Christianity and many of the objections that people raise to God are philosophical objections, right? They say things like, well, how can you believe in something you can't even see? Or, what reason do you have for believing that the universe came from a designer? Or what do you do about the problem of evil? You know, is there any response to that? Isn't that just a knockdown argument against Christianity? A lot of these kind of objections are philosophical. So I think that if Christians are to have good responses to them, they have to be good at philosophy, right? They have to be good at analyzing arguments, show where those arguments are not as strong as you might think, and that we might have even as good, if not better, arguments on our side as Christians. So I think that that's super important. So that's the kind of the defense, right? In terms of the offense, right? You're gonna want to have arguments of your own, but not just arguments of your own. You also want to think very carefully about theology itself, right? In terms of like, what is the nature of God? What's God's relationship with time? How can God have foreknowledge? All these kinds of things. These are very much in the area of philosophy. And I think that some of the best theology that's done is informed by, is strengthened by careful philosophical thought and argument, right? So I think that if we're going to articulate, if we're going to think well in theology, philosophy is a very helpful handmaiden, right, to that theological task. So I think both for the perspective of defending Christianity against its critics and attackers, but also kind of articulating and explaining and elucidating what theology is. I think philosophy is essential for both those tasks.
Yeah, I think on that, Isaac Newton, he wrote quite a bit about theology, which is pretty interesting. Um,
That's right.
interesting, I think.
He actually spent more time doing Bible and
Oh,
theology. He wrote two books on biblical interpretation. A lot of people don't realize that. He actually wrote two books on biblical interpretation. And he spent more time on that than on the science. And I think maybe some physicists might bemoan that, but I think that it shows that it's completely possible to be like a world-class scientist as well as a, committed follower of God.
mhm. And I think, I mean, it's not just Isaac Newton. Some of the greatest pioneers of science were believers, including
Right.
Galileo. He obviously had his own whole thing with the Catholic Church, which is that was quite an interesting episode. Um, this is just a random question. You brought up the statistic about around 25% of philosophers in America being theists. Are the other remaining, are they, do they lean more to the agnostic side or to the more atheist side?
They're probably split.
Oh, okay.
Some are more kind of fervent evangelical atheists, and they'd be, happy to try to deconstruct anyone's belief. But I think a good chunk are also agnostics, and they're like, well, I don't know, and they're both arguments pro and con, and so I can't make up my mind about that. Maybe we can't even know whether or not a God exists, right? So I think that I don't know the exact numbers. I haven't seen that figure.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that that's something that is definitely, a split between the remainder.
And there are actually two sort of main types of agnosticism, which is like either I really just don't know, or
Mhm.
God is unknowable,
Yeah.
which I think is quite interesting. Uh, this is a completely separate direction, but is there any Christian or non-Christian theist philosopher that you really like? Because I do know my dad studied under Cornelius Plantinga, he used to be the head of the theology department at Calvin University. And my dad,
Mhm.
just a few days ago, he told me like, I think that for every atheist philosopher, at one point they'll have to face the mammoth of Alvin Plantinga, which I thought that was quite awesome. Who are some theist philosophers that you kind of look up to and think that people should read into?
Yeah, I think that probably the ones that come to mind most is Alvin Plantinga. Clearly, he was my dissertation director at Notre Dame, and so I just have a great deal of respect for him. He has written so much, in terms of Christian philosophy, but also both in epistemology in terms of theory of knowledge. How can we know about God, as well as metaphysics in terms of the nature of things, reality of God. Um, all these kinds of things. He's had such a huge impact. But I think I respect him even more because when I actually met him in person and got to know him, he had such a humility and kindness and gentleness that oftentimes, like, people who are intellectually gifted, they will be arrogant and harsh and cruel to other people. But he was not. He was so gentle and very kind to his students and even to those he disagreed with. Um, I'm actually co-writing a book on the philosophy of Alvin Plantinga
Oh, okay.
for lay people. So that his kind of legacy is very much on my mind. So that would be one. Another very uh, like another philosopher that I highly respect was Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard, he taught at University of Southern California, and he writes in a somewhat different philosophical tradition than me. He did a lot of work in phenomenology and Husserl and various other things. But I think his bigger impact actually is writing on Christian spirituality, right? So he wrote a number of books about spiritual discipline, spiritual formation, as well as hearing God, various other things. And I've taken a lot away from him in terms of thinking about the Christian life in a very systematic and careful way in terms of Christian spirituality. So I respect him super highly. And a third philosopher that I really appreciated is William Alston. Alston is not as well known as the other two, but he was actually at one point Plantinga's teacher.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and so Plantinga studied under him. And Alston, he also too had a very deep spirituality like Dallas Willard. And he was very influential in terms of forming this academic organization called the Society of Christian Philosophers in the 1970s. And he has a super interesting story because he had been raised as a Christian, but then as he became an adult, he kind of drifted away from the faith. So that by the time he was a philosophy professor, he had pretty much become an agnostic and atheist, didn't really practice the faith at all. But in the middle of his career, he had a sabbatical and he was spending some time at Oxford. And he happened to be invited by, I think, his daughter to an evensong service as one of the chapels. And apparently, at this evensong service, he had this tremendous experience of God in the service that he even had a hard time describing it, right? Even in words. But that was kind of like the pivot of his life. And after that, he really, came back to church. He became get back to belief in God, and he kept on praying to God, like, Lord, I wasted half of my life, doing my own thing. I want you to tell me what you want me to do with the rest of my life because I want to do it for you. And he kept praying, Lord, what should I work on? What should I write on? And over again, God kept on speaking to him, saying, work on philosophy of religion, work on philosophy of religion. Because at that time, you remember, this is like the 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 heyday of the logical positivist movement, in which like people were not publicly Christian, people were not publicly theists. And so he did this, and he wrote a number of very influential papers and books. And I was talking to Alvin Plantinga about Alston's work, and Al, as oftentimes his students call him, Al said to me, I knew Alston's work from before his conversion and after his conversion, and he said that there was like a quantum leap in terms of the quality and strength of his philosophical arguments after his conversion when he started writing about the philosophy of religion stuff. And I think Al could only attribute that to like the influence of the Holy Spirit in terms of directing him in his ideas and things like that. And it's so incredible because even secular philosophers, when they saw what Alston wrote in philosophy of religion, they would be like, You have such strong arguments here. You should actually republish this part of this book as a secular philosophy book because I think it's such a strong argument. So even like secular philosophers had a very deep respect for Alston's work in the philosophy of religion. Um, and how that kind of influenced all these other fields in philosophy. So anyway, so those are just some of the ones that I really have looked up to and respected, and hopefully I can try to be like them to some degree, some measure, small measure in my own teaching and in my own research.
Yeah, I have read God in Other Minds by Plantinga, and
Mm.
I thought it was just really well written. This is a question on the flip side. Are there any kind of atheist philosophers that you would actually that you've read into that you think would be helpful for kind of thoughtful commentary and strengthening one's own arguments as well as kind of delving into the other side a little bit?
Yeah, I mean maybe there are a number out there. Probably like the one that comes to mind most immediately is Evan Fales. Um, And then who's Graham Oppy?
Oh,
He's an
well,
Australian philosopher.
mhm,
Yeah, some of these are like the mo most famous atheistic philosophers, or at least philosophers who critique theism. So I think that there are a number of very strong philosophers on both sides of this question, right?
mhm,
And so I mean, there's definitely if anything, like in the broader philosophical world, as I said earlier, most of them are atheists or agnostics. So like
mhm,
probably mo most of the most famous philosophers out there are atheists or agnostics. Um, but it's interesting that in the sub area of philosophy of religion, there are probably more theists than there are atheists or agnostics out there who are better known. And so then the question is it because the arguments are better on that side, or is it just that, people who are drawn to that field are the ones who already believe in God, right? So it's kind of like chicken and the egg.
yeah,
What's the causal kind of connection there?
mhm,
Um, but yeah, so I mean, so those are some of the two that immediately come to mind as like some of the better ones. You mentioned Quentin Smith earlier. He focused a lot on like cosmology and physics in terms of and so he had a lot of interactions with William Lane Craig about kind of Big Bang, early universe cosmology type issues. Um, yeah, so I think that there are very many capable philosophers out there on both sides of the issue. Of course, there's a lot of philosophers and just lay people who are really bad at this, right? They can have really bad arguments, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of Stephen Hawking, like Richard Dawkins, right? Like
yeah,
he's a biologist. He has no business doing philosophy. Like, even atheists have said of like Richard Dawkins' philosophical arguments in God delusion that these are just terrible arguments. I've even seen atheists write like, Dawkins makes me ashamed to be an atheist
oh,
because his arguments are so terrible, right?
mhm,
They're like basically worthy of like, freshman college, papers. It's like,
yeah,
it's just not high quality. So I mean, so but don't I think that it's kind of like, and there are just as many probably bad Christian or theistic philosophers or thinkers. But I think the names that I was talking about earlier in terms of Plantinga, Alston, Fales, Oppie, these are like more like higher quality thinkers, right? In terms of like the strength of their arguments.
I will say the first time I feel like Alvin Plant Dr. Plantinga sounded a little bit annoyed was when I read his article called "The Dawkins Confusion," and he's writing a
Mm.
response to the God delusion that Richard Dawkins wrote. And in this, he says the famous line like his argument sounds sophomoric, and like his
Yeah.
annoying, smarter than thou tone of arguing can be really annoying. He writes that straight into his book article, which I thought that was pretty funny. And I guess I wanted to. I mentioned this because I feel like for the general public, I kind of wish they didn't delve too much into this sort of rhetorical sophistry thing to kind of formulate their opinion on something that's pretty big, which is theism and
Yeah.
atheism. I feel
Hmm.
like a lot of them look towards Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, the new atheists. Yeah, I was saying like it's also it might be a disservice to yourself if you're not giving yourself ample material to argue with if you're gonna use Dawkins, because I remember specifically in the God Delusion he sort of butchers Thomas Aquinas, which I say if you look at people like Bertrand Russell, Graham Oppy, you will yourself as an atheist have stronger arguments to use and better mechanisms to kind of debate on your own point. So that is a comment that I have for that.
Yep,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, if you were to say one argument stands out to you for theism, what would it be?
I think definitely without question for me, it would be the fine-tuning argument, right? And it's not just because I have a predilection towards physics, right? And because fine-tuning is really a physics-based argument. It's also because most atheists who have some cognizance of the literature, right? Who've actually kept up to date in terms of like what philosophers are talking about. Um, they would point to fine-tuning as what many atheists consider to be the strongest argument for theism, right? And in a similar way that like many Christians or theists would say, problem of evil would be the strongest argument against theism, right? That kind of idea. So yeah, the fine-tuning argument, just in a nutshell, is this idea that there's certain kind of physical constants to the laws of nature or the initial conditions of the universe right at the Big Bang um, that seem highly finely tuned, right? In other words, like you can think about it like a piano, right? Piano has all these different strings, and each of them have to be precisely tuned, otherwise it's going to play out of tune, right? It's going to play off key. And so and it's not enough just to fine tune one or two of those strings in the piano. You have to fine tune all of them, right? So the idea is there's several dozen of these constants in the laws of nature or in the initial conditions of the Big Bang that if even one of them was just slightly off, you could not have life at all in the universe, right? In fact, it's not just carbon-based life or life as we know, it's like any kind of life. Because, like, for example, many of these, if they were just slightly off, you wouldn't even have atoms, right? So it's not just focused on carbon or silicon or anything like that. It's just no atoms would exist or no stars would exist. And so because of this, many physicists as well as philosophers have looked at that state of affairs. And we've only really known this for about 50 years, actually. And they said, this is very strange. Why is the universe in this very tiny little zone, this habitable zone of the possibility space of all the different ways that the laws could be? Um, what's the better explanation of this? Is it that we just happen to luck into a universe that allows for life, or is that maybe there was a designer who intentionally made the laws so that life can exist? And so this is where it seems like it's much more probable that the universe is a result of design as opposed to random chance, from these kind of fine-tuned constants of the universe. So that's just in a nutshell, the fine-tuning argument.
Can you name an example of one kind of super fine-tuned thing that if it was a little bit off, we wouldn't be able to, live?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many. Maybe the easiest way to or the yeah so there's these four different fundamental laws in physics, right? And two of them are what's known as the law of gravity, which is the one that everyone's aware of, right? And then the slightly less known one is the electromagnetic force, right? And both of these laws have a certain constant in the equations, right? And the constant tells you how strong that force is, right? So gravity actually turns out to be much weaker than the electromagnetic force. And this is why you can overcome gravity really well. Like I can take my phone and just hold it up and I can overcome gravity just by holding it up. And the only reason I can hold up the phone is because there's electromagnetic repulsion between the electrons in my hand and the electrons in the phone, right? It's strong enough to overcome gravity pretty easily. And so these forces are at different strengths relative to each other. And physicists have found that if you actually change that relative strength, if you made electromagnetism slightly weaker, if you made gravity slightly stronger relative to each other, you couldn't have stable protons, right? Protons just could not exist, right? And in my presentations on this, I have shown like a chart, like a two-dimensional chart that shows you, the relative strength of gravity versus electromagnetic force. And it's like this tiny little zone in which protons can exist and be stable. Every other area, either protons can't exist, or they'll decay very quickly, or you can't have atoms bigger than like hydrogen or helium, all these kind of things. And so that would just be one example in which it's like, well, anyone who with high school chemistry will know if you don't have protons, you can't have atoms, you can't have atoms, you can't have chemistry, you can't have chemistry, you can't have life, right, of any kind. And so I think that this is one example of like, the fine tuning involved in just this one relationship between gravity and electromagnetism that's required for any kind of life to exist.
What about an example that's a little bit closer to home, like I don't know, like our distance to the sun kind of example?
Hmm. That's usually not considered to be a fine-tuned aspect
Oh,
of the
okay.
universe. And the reason why is this, because that is a specific property about our planet,
Ah, I see.
right? So,
Hmm.
like, yes, you're right in the sense that if the planet was much closer to the sun or further away from the sun, that we'd either freeze or burn up. Like, we'd be frozen on Mars, we'd be burnt up on Venus. It's a good thing we're on Earth, right? The problem, though, is that there are many, many planets in the universe, right? And we've actually discovered thousands of these what are called exoplanets, planets that are circling other stars. We've actually detected them around thousands of other stars in our galaxy. And so, therefore, if there are billions of galaxies and billions of planets around all these stars in these galaxies, then yeah, even if Earth were not a habitable world, I'm sure there would be other planets elsewhere that would be have a certain distance from the sun. So that's not, a fine-tuned thing. Because you have a lot of different lottery tickets,
Hmm.
out there with all these stars around all these planets. Sorry, all these planets around all these stars, and all these stars around all these galaxies.
Hmm.
And so by chance, one of these lottery tickets would could have been a winner. Whereas these fine-tuned constants are things that are true across the universe,
Oh, okay,
right?
I see.
The force of gravity, the electromagnetic force, they're true here and in Andromeda, in every galaxy that we've observed, it's the same force. And so if the force weren't correct in the correct ratio here, it wouldn't be in the correct ratio in Andromeda or any of these other galaxies. And so it's kind of like you have one shot, one lottery ticket, and it happens to be that our lottery ticket is a winner. Whereas something like the distance, and this is sometimes called the privileged planet hypothesis, that like, we're living on a very special planet. Um, but I think that that's not as strong of an argument because you have billions of planets around billions of stars and billions of galaxies, that kind of thing. And so even if you have a very improbable planet, that's still possible in a universe with trillions and trillions of planets, right?
So yeah, kind of the Dawkinsian approach that I've seen was that he postulated the multiverse, and he said, well,
Yes.
if we have like all of these like a bunch of universes, then like or in a near infinite universe, number of universes, then wouldn't it be fine, or like wouldn't it be kind of not so improbable that some of them have these kind of fine-tuned constants that are
Right.
composing their very fabric?
So it's a very similar move to like this privileged planet, the response to privileged planet hypothesis, right? It's kind of like, well, okay, the laws don't vary in our universe. Oh, but maybe there's these other universes in which the laws are just slightly different, right? And of course, this is very popular with Marvel and all these other sci-fi things that have come out recently in terms of the multiverse kind of thing. Um, so I have a whole talk on this actually, in terms of like, does the multiverse help with fine tuning? And in fact, that's the only actually move that atheists can actually make against fine tuning. Because if you compare the likelihood of fine tuning on God versus a single atheistic universe, clearly it's much more probable on God, right? So then you have to have like multiple universes try to increase the number of lottery tickets, right? That, so you can have a chance of winning. Problem there, though, is that it really depends on the details of the multiverse theory. And there's at least four different kinds of multiverses. So in my talk, I actually list all the different types of multiverse and like, in which categories they fall into. But basically what happens is either a multiverse ends up with having different universes that have the same laws, which doesn't help at all with fine tuning because then it's just as much of a puzzle, right? Why are all these different universes within a multiverse with the same loss? That doesn't help us. It's the same lottery ticket, right? It's not different lottery tickets, right? Or it requires um, a set of conditions in what's been sometimes called a universe generator, right? There's, according to some of these multiverse theories, that there's this larger kind of physical kind of process or laws that produce all these kind of baby universes that all have different, properties within them, right? And this involves one of these kinds of, quantum gravity theories called string theory, right? And string theory is this very kind of speculative theoretical view that says that, actually all these fundamental particles like protons and photons, oh, sorry, quarks, electrons and photons, they're actually tiny little strings. that are just vibrating and moving around in different ways. And so if you have a particular kind of string theory and you have a particular kind of cosmology, right? You can create, this kind of universe generator. Now, the problem there is, well, there's multiple problems there. One is string theory is notorious among physicists that we have no experimental evidence for it, right? So some physicists have condemned string theory, saying this is just science fiction. This is not really science because there's no experiment that we can run that shows that string theory is true or false, that kind of thing. But even if string theory were shown to be true, which it hasn't, but even if it's shown to be true, the problem actually just pushes the problem of fine tuning to another level because what turns out is that this universe generator has to be finely tuned in order to produce the universes with the right kind of variation among them to give you lots of lottery tickets. And if that generator has to be fine-tuned, you're just kind of, moving that fine-tuning from one level to another, to a deeper, lower level. It's kind of like if you have a lump in the carpet, you kind of try to stomp down that lump, and the lump just moves to a different part of the carpet. And it's a similar kind of problem here. And so I think that and I could talk a lot more about this obviously because I have a whole hour-long talk on it,
Yeah.
but the idea is that depending on the type of multiverse we're talking about, either it doesn't help with fine-tuning at all, or that it introduces another level of fine tuning. So you don't really get rid of fine tuning, right? So I think that that is it's the most popular kind of response to fine tuning among atheists, philosophers, and physicists. But I think that it doesn't really solve the problem in the end, actually.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. It's a bit of a caveat that they're doing, but it'll have to. It's sort of like they're popping into a whole new realm of things with the whole multiverse.
Hmm.
So on the fine tuning argument, I think Isaac Newton. I don't know if he had. I don't know if this is exactly the fine tuning argument. Maybe it's a different. Maybe it's a variation. Maybe it's completely different entirely. He said kind of that the I guess the harmony of the universe, and how kind of the mathematical beauty of it has to point to some sort of creator. What do you take that as an argument, and do you think it is kind of do you think it's sort of related to fine tuning, or do you think it's kind of completely
It's related in the sense that both fine tuning and this kind of move by Newton are both varieties of what's called the design argument or arguments from design to God, in the sense that, like, the idea that God as the designer of the universe or of biological features or things like that is much more likely than chance or necessity or something like that, right? I think it is significantly different though because um, fine tuning is much more kind of quantifiable, right?
I see.
We can put out that graph and say, okay, it's only within this tiny little region where life can exist, whereas the realm of possibilities is so much bigger. Like, why is it in that tiny little region, right? So you can kind of quantify that. Whereas the kind of biological arguments for design or from harmony, it's kind of like, well, yeah, I can kind of see how like the structure of the eye or like, the stability of the planets around the sun. Like that's something that like Newton would like point to, right? Saying there's the harmony of celestial mechanics, right? There's a certain kind of aesthetic beauty to it, like there's a certain kind of elegance to it. But a critic might say, well, that's just kind of subjective, that's just kind of like, you know, um, yeah, okay, the eye works, but evolution could have produced it. So that kind of response. Whereas fine tuning, you don't really have that kind of subjectivity. It's like, well, look at the data, look at this graph, and it seems very improbable that apart from multiverse, that we just happen to be in like the lucky zone, right? That kind of idea. So I think that that's where it's like fine tuning is a stronger argument. Than its kind of sibling arguments in the argument from design. I think they do carry some force, but as I mentioned, especially after Darwinian evolution, I think the atheists can always just say, well, somehow it evolved over the course of millions and millions of years, and that's why we can see that kind of thing. Whereas, to our knowledge, there's no celestial evolution. There's no kind of, fine-tuning evolution because as far as we can see back to the Big Bang, like the laws of physics have not changed. The strength of gravity has not changed for billions of years, right? So there's no kind of evolutionary process that you can apply to fine-tuning type phenomena.
Mhm. I was wondering, yeah, because you did mention the sort of aesthetics side to that argument, and within all the arguments for theism, I guess sort of the weaker ones that I've thought were kind of the moral argument. You might completely disagree with me, but I guess the moral argument I never really found the ontological argument super compelling, but maybe I've just heard it in a completely straw man way. And I guess I've never found aesthetics too compelling either, and I might be completely wrong about that. Um, but what do you make of kind of the argument from beauty, especially when we have all the Darwinian theories that are out there?
Yeah, I think that, I don't think it's as strong of an argument, but I think there is something to be said there. It's kind of a piece. It's in the same kind of area as the argument from morality or from ethics, in the sense that like there's something that there's a certain kind of, and this is where it's kind of logical positivism doesn't like, operate here because it's kind of like, you know, to see beauty? Like, can you measure beauty?
Oh, I see.
Or like, can you see ethics? Can you see morality? All these kind of things. I think in our kind of the hangover of logical positivism, like we feel that those are not as strong arguments because it's not something that we can quantify and bring to the lab or that kind of thing, right? We're like, well, when we see beauty, when we see injustice, we see that it's there. Like for those of us who believe in such things, right? We see it's there. It's triggered by our sense perception, but you can't see the beauty itself, or you can't see the injustice itself, right? Even though you see like the slave driver doing this, or you see like, the beautiful painting or the beautiful sunset, like you see it, but there's something that, anyway, so we can talk a lot about that, but like, I think that there's a certain kind of, and I think that's why our, our modernity, we don't find those arguments as compelling because even though we have these experiences of beauty, we have these experiences of morality, um, we tend to dismiss them because they're not like as like quantifiable. They're not as measurable, right? But I do think that like these things can be strong, right? Because I think that, you know, we can really ask people like, do you really think that like there is no objective beauty in the world? There's no difference between this beautiful thing and this ugly thing. Like that there really isn't a difference. Or that there really is no difference between, love and slavery, or between racism and acceptance of difference. Like that there really is no difference. I think most people, when you press them on that, they'll say, no, actually I do admit that like racism truly is wrong or that I really do think that like a beautiful sunset or a beautiful forest or a beautiful flower, that really is like beautiful. And I think that then it becomes like, well, then how do we explain that from an evolutionary process? It doesn't seem like you can. And so I think that you can work up pretty good arguments there. But I think that we're kind of prejudiced against it, against these types of arguments because of that kind of hangover from logical positivism.
Yeah, I think with the moral argument, people try to like push back with all their ideas of Kantianism and then utilitarianism. And even though I do kind of see morality as a little bit weaker, I am I am glad that it exists. That
Mm.
argument because I feel like I don't know if there's a lot of truth value or strength in this, but I've heard some atheists say that just the fact that there's so many arguments for God is in itself an argument for God, which I thought
Yeah.
was pretty interesting. Um, but I guess another question that I have for you is a pushback that a lot of atheists have is that you know when we have all these arguments, wouldn't it be God of the gaps like, which is sort of for those who don't know, God of the gaps is this idea that for any phenomena that we can't explain or for things that are yeah, for things that we don't know yet, we kind of put God as a placeholder. Like, the Greeks did it with lightning and Zeus, um, and then they say, well, isn't it kind of God of the gaps? Even if you have all these arguments, that the best explanation is an explanation that we don't really know about. And the pushback that I've heard from the theistic perspective is that it's not necessarily gap in the sense that it's it's completely out of our reach. It's sort of like a case where it's like beyond reasonable doubt, where it's not 100% verifiable and it can't run through a complete verification principle, but it is the best explanation and it's beyond reasonable doubt. What do you take of the remaining God of the gaps question, especially with something as large as theism and not something, I guess, smaller like thunder or a birthday cake? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think that oftentimes that kind of accusation is thrown around. And I think to some degree there are situations in which kind of God of the gaps reasoning is bad reasoning, right?
Hmm.
And actually, I would argue it oftentimes is naturalism of the gaps too, right?
Oh, I see.
And sometimes like atheists will say, well, I can't explain, the origins of life, or I can't explain fine tuning right now, but in the future, I'm confident that we'll come up with some kind of scientific explanation. It's like, well, aren't you just kind of plugging in your ignorance of how those things work with like naturalism of the gaps or science of the gaps? So I think that both sides can do this kind of move, and I think that it is illegitimate, right? And well, when is God of the gaps or naturalism of the gaps reasoning good or bad? I think it's bad when you haven't really investigated or even thought about, different possibilities, and you just say, "Well, God did it," or "Science will do it," that kind of thing. That's just lazy, right?
Yeah.
Whereas Whereas I think it's not such a bad move if, in fact, you've thought about it, you've investigated it, you've examined all the other possible explanations, and you find out that all the other explanations really suck and are really bad, right? They're bad explanations, and therefore you come finally to your this final hypothesis and say, well, I think this hypothesis is a better explanation for that, right? So I think um, in the philosophy of science, there's this kind of principle of reasoning called inference to the best explanation, right? It's this idea that you have all these different rival explanations. If you jump to one explanation without even looking at the other ones and examining whether or not they explain the data and the evidence, then that would be the lazy God of the gaps kind of move. Whereas if you look at the God hypothesis and you look at the atheistic hypothesis and all the other rival hypotheses, and you say, well, given all the evidence out there, given all our observations from physics, from kind of our internal experiences of morality and beauty and all these other things, what is the best explanation for these things? And I think that, when you've really examined it and you've seen that, like, this particular hypothesis is such a better explanation than all these other ones, then that's not lazy reasoning. That's actually a considered conclusion that you've come to by examining these things. And I think when we're doing the philosophy of religion, putting arguments back and forth on this, that's what we're doing. We're basically saying which theory, which hypothesis best fits the empirical as well as non-empirical evidence that we have, and then we can make some kind of conclusion from that. So I think that sometimes people make that claim, but I think that it really depends on the details of the situation, right? In terms of have these other things been tried, and if it's been tried for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's been found lacking, then maybe this other view is the better explanation. I think that like, when you said earlier that, the fact that there's so many arguments for God's existence is actually a further reason or further argument for God's existence. I think it's referring to this kind of inference to the best explanation. One of the reasons why, at least from a Christian perspective, theism is the better explanation is because it unifies all these kind of disparate phenomena, right? I can look at fine tuning. I can look at the experience of morality. I can look at the experience of beauty. I can look at all these other arguments that we can put forward. Even things that we haven't even talked about, things like, the Leibnizian cosmological argument or the argument from contingency and all these other things.
Hmm.
It's like theism can explain all these things in a kind of unifying way, whereas atheism has to come up with all these different kinds of explanations for these things in a very non-unified way. And I think that that's one of the advantages, one of the things that further shows why theism is the better explanation, right? In philosophy of science, we call this feature, this theoretical virtue called unification. Does it unify kind of phenomena that seem at first disparate, but are actually have a deep interconnection, right? And I think so. For example, like DNA, like DNA is one of these unifying theories that bring together so many different aspects of biology and molecular biology, genetics, all these kind of things. And this is why it's a superior theory than many of its other rivals that were discarded in the kind of contest during the 20th century to explain kind of genetic inheritance. But anyway, so I think I would make a similar kind of case that um, theism functions in a very unifying way in terms of bringing together all these different phenomena.
Yeah, I've always kind of treated it like a court case.
Hmm.
Kind of like what evidence you have and what makes the best explanation. And when it comes to theism versus when it comes to theism or like the bigger questions, they're really do you think they're kind of tackling the why with the universe?
It, I I think that's sometimes how people frame it, that like science tells us the what and theology tells us the why. I don't think that's quite true. I think that,
Okay.
there's some aspects of that that are true, but theism also says like some what claims, right? So
Yeah.
like it claims that like at the base level of reality is not matter and energy. The base level of reality is God. Like there's a spiritual being at the base level of reality, and everything else depends on him. That's not a why question. That's a what. Like what exists? What's behind the universe? Similarly, like most versions of theism would say that humans are not just bodies. We're not just physical beings, but we have souls. Souls that are in a real way spiritual, like God, right? And again, at the base level of human nature is immaterial soul. And I think that kind of connecting with our earlier discussion about free will, that's the thing that actually gives us free will,
Hmm.
right? If it's just atoms in motion, then all our decisions are ultimately a result of the firing of neurons. They're basically governed by physical and chemical and biological laws. And so therefore all our actions would be determined regardless of what quantum mechanics says, right? Whereas if there's a element to us that's spiritual, that can behave in ways that are not dictated by the laws of physics and chemistry and biology, then there's actually room for genuine free will among humans. So I mean, that's another what question. Like, what are we as humans, right? The atheistic or quote scientific response is, oh no, we're just biological creatures. Whereas a Christian or theistic response would be, no, no, we're these hybrid creatures that have a physical body, but also immaterial soul, right? So I think yes, the many of the things that theism and Christianity address are why questions, but I don't think they're completely separable in that way.
Do you think this is just a rapid fire question before I get to my last topic, but
Okay.